What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Geneforge 2 Infestation. A remaster, of course, to the 2003 game Geneforge 2, a sequel, naturally, to Geneforge. And the second entry here expands on the concepts of the first game, I think, pretty well, continuing to put us in the role of shapers, wizards who can shape life, which leads to a unique story with some fun game mechanics. But before we dive into all of that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There is a video linked below that will talk about everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. One other quick note on that is that while I was playing this one, a storm blew through my area and I lost internet connection for most of a day, and Steam doesn't seem to have registered my playtime for that particular day, so the playtime is actually about 10 hours more than what Steam is showing right now, with a total time spent with it about 50 hours. Not super important, but it's a thing that happens sometimes, and figured I would mention it for anybody who actually looks at the Steam profile. With all of that out of our way, though, let's talk a little more specifically about Geneforge 2. As I mentioned, this is a remake of a 2003 title. The first game was already remade as Geneforge 1 Mutagen, and my understanding is there is an intention to remaster the other 3 games in the series, as there are 5 in this series total, and seeing how Spiderweb Software, the developer, is behind a bunch of RPGs I have not played just yet, it only made sense to check out this particular release. As I'm sure you've seen, this game is a sort of classic isometric CRPG, but what really sets it apart is the incredibly interesting story and premise. And while the game certainly lacks, I would say, some of the production value of a lot of more recent entries into the genre, it still has a lot to offer, especially in the story and world department. First up, though, you do not need to have played the original title to have played this one, but because it is a sequel, it's a little hard to talk about this one without mentioning some important events from the first game, which means there might be some contextual spoilers for that stuff, mainly in the story section of this video, which is coming up, so do keep that in mind. The core premise of the Geneforge series, though, is that a faction of wizards known as the Shapers have developed the ability to shape life. They can magically create and alter biological things, which includes everything from simple plant life all the way up to intelligent humanoids. They've used this power to effectively control the entire land, and while human beings who are not shapers, known as commons, largely self-govern, with the shapers not really getting involved unless it involves shaping or their control, they do use that power to effectively rule with an iron fist against anything that would even slightly infringe upon their total power. But given just the nature of their power, you add in the natural, I would say, places that story could go, all sorts of ethical dilemmas around what creating life means, and especially intelligent life, and you've got a potential for a lot of great storytelling that I think this game handles pretty wonderfully. Over the course of this review, I'll try to mention that in Geneforge, a lot of these concepts are introduced, but we never really see the Shaper's side of it, and the Geneforge sequel here, I think, does a much better job of telling you who the Shapers are as an organization, what they aspire to, how they rule, what the consequences are for betraying them, or simply doing anything they don't want you to do, and exploring a lot of the nuances of those situations are where this game is at its best, and where I was having the most fun with it. But with all of that said, let's talk about a few other things. So I always like to talk about the technical state of new game releases. In the case of Geneforge 2, it was pretty flawless. Really, the only thing I have to report here personally is that occasionally the game would freeze and hang on me for a few seconds, really, before correcting itself and going back to normal. Not really sure what was causing that, but even that was pretty rare. And beyond that, I didn't have a single issue with it, and I haven't seen any reports of anybody else really dealing with any problems. So as far as the technical state of this one goes, it looks to be in a pretty good place. Now, when you fire up a game, the first thing you're going to be presented with is a choice between 3 different classes, effectively, and the difficulty options. Your class is the choice between a guardian, a shaper, or an agent. Depending on which one you pick here, it determines what your character is good at and how easy it is to level up the associated thing. For instance, guardians are great in melee combat, or ranged even. They basically have a lot of weapon skill, but they're not very good at magic. Shapers are really good at shaping, that is to say, creating creatures which form your party. alongside using magic. Agents, on the other hand, are bad at actually creating creatures, but are great with basically everything else. So depending on which of these you pick, you will have a definitely different experience, though I will say the sort of default option is just the basic Shaper. After that though, you pick between 4 different difficulty options between Casual and Torment. Altering these will change things like enemy health, abilities, they get more as the difficulty goes up. It also changes their chance to hit and resistances. But I would say the main thing that I really noticed in between playing on different difficulties was that as that difficulty goes up, enemies become more resistant to mental effects, which often are the bulk of, say, stun effects that you might use to take their turns away, which is definitely going to make combat a little bit harder because it is less reliable to simply lock down enemies. Which means, somewhat strangely, that what typically winds up being the easiest way to play through the game is a stealth pacifist route where you look for alternative solutions to problems rather than fighting everything head on. So in terms of gameplay, you do actually have options, and I do think the easiest way to play overall was usually just the pacifist route. From there though, let's talk about the actual story setup and my thoughts on it. Again, going to be some light spoilers here, especially for the first game, but also a little bit of the second game because some of the things I want to talk about are technically spoilers. So you have been warned on that front. If you don't want the spoilers, obviously skip ahead, but I will say just across the board, I thought the story was fantastic, and honestly probably the best part of what this game has to offer. Moving on from there though, in this particular game, we play as a novice under the tutelage of one Agent Shanti, and we are being sent to investigate the Dry Peak Mountains, a Shaper colony that was supposed to be revitalizing the area, bringing life back to an otherwise lifeless place. This has not gone well. Seemingly nothing is getting done, but once you arrive and start talking to the 2 Shapers you're supposed to find, you quickly find out that they're hiding something. Something has clearly not gone to plan. One of the Shapers you're supposed to find is supposedly dead, so naturally you need to do a bit of investigation. A short ways into the title, after talking and investigating, you'll come across a pass into the rest of the mountain range, and upon stepping through that, you find out that the Shapers have actually been incredibly successful in revitalizing the area, doing so with methods that are technically illegal according to Shapers' laws. With the mountains themselves torn between 4 different factions who can't agree on a way forward and are actively fighting each other, and now that you're here, their presence is definitely going to be detected by the Shaper Council at large, so things have come to a bit of a head. And you have to decide what to do here, which factions to help, if any, and how you feel about what is going on between the Shaper Council's laws, the way these people have approached these things. But where it gets especially cool is the expansion of what Shapers are all about. This game does a much better job of exploring the notion of what Shapers are and their place in the world alongside just common everyday people. So first and foremost, while it might not seem like it, this game is actually directly connected to the first one, though it doesn't really address any of the endings of that game. Just the broad strokes main event. The first game saw you investigating something known as the Geneforge on Susia Island, a barred island that Shapers don't allow anyone to go to. You wash up there on accident, only to discover the Geneforge, a valuable bit of experimental research that grants extreme powers, allowing people to do just crazy things with shaping. After the events of the first game, the Shaper Council is notified of Susia Island's goings-on, and basically orders the entire place burnt to the ground. 2 of the Shapers ordered to do this discover the Geneforge, steal a lot of its research and secrets, and bring them to the Dry Peak Mountains, their next assignment, where they then use all that research to perform their many illegal dealings that have led to the unprecedented growth of the mountain range. And it is through these people, those 2 Shapers and the factions that have joined around them alongside a couple of other factions that we'll talk a little more in depth about later, that they really expand what this world is all about and how it's presented. And I would honestly say just the many general mindsets that you might approach a situation like this with. As a result of all that, though, there's ultimately, I would say, 6 major endings to the game. One that sees you siding with each of the factions, one that sees you siding with no faction but taking action yourself, and then I would say the only truly bad ending where you choose to do nothing. Those other 5 endings, though, are really, I would say, the best bit of nuance to what the game has to offer, because none of these factions are entirely right, and they're not entirely wrong either. You have a faction led by intelligent serviles, one of the creations of Shapers that are meant to do menial work, but they have managed to attain real intelligence and have started building a culture and society for themselves. and they've made it very clear they're not really interested in being slaves to the Shapers anymore. Then you have a faction of people that are just loyal to Shaper laws, because while Shaper laws are harsh, a lot of them are in place for a reason, as doing experimental things with biology can just ruin ecosystems and cause untold devastation to areas, as creations are known to go rogue if you don't have the will to control them, especially the less intelligent ones that are prone to going just feral and working off of just mindless instinct. Then you have a faction like the Takers. These are intelligent creations that, instead of wanting to deal equally with the Shapers, want to destroy them outright because the Shapers have done nothing but try to kill them. And the Takers don't want to kill all humans, they just want to destroy the Shapers specifically. But obviously it's a little more nuanced than that, and as you explore the story you find out that what a lot of these people mean, at least through their intentions, isn't necessarily what they live up to in their actions. And deciding the morality of that, who's right, who's wrong, is all up to you, which makes the ending, I would say, feel especially satisfying, and it's very, very well done. I loved the premise of Geneforge 1, and I really liked what they had built there, but the way they expanded on it in 2 is really something else. I genuinely loved the story of this game. But with all of that out of the way, let's finally talk about something else, which is progression systems. Now, mechanically speaking, this game is very similar to the original title. Not too much changes, but there are a few notable differences that keep it familiar but still pretty interesting. Progression ultimately comes down to leveling up, your skills, learning new skills via things like trainers or canisters, and then gear. So first up, leveling up as you either engage in combat or avoid it, complete quests, etc. You'll be gaining experience, which then leads to level ups, and every time you level up, you get 10 skill points to spend on one of your various skills, such as your base stats, your weapon skills, your magic skills, your shaping skills, or your just general skills. And all of these do different things, but mostly it's the same as the first game here, and most of it I would say is pretty self-explanatory. Most everyone is going to want base stat increases unless you're doing a pure pacifist run where really that stuff shouldn't matter nearly as much. And then everything else kind of just depends on how you're building your character. If you want to go completely pacifist, you need the general skills of leadership, mechanics, and stealth to avoid as many encounters as possible. If you want to create as many creatures as you can, which in my opinion is like the default way to play the game given the premise, then you want these shaping skills. But even with that, you have to decide what sort of creations you would like to be able to make. So even there's some variance, and especially since there's brand new creations in this one, including a sort of dragonkin race known as the Drakon, which were a personal favorite of mine. Outside of that, though, you can learn new spells and magic from either trainers or canisters. Canisters were how you did this in the original game. They were fonts of the Geneforge power basically distilled into a canister that you could use to then innately teach you something. That is still present in this game, but they added on to that the addition of finding trainers and learning things that way, just someone teaching you at the cost of gold. This is how you can learn to also make new creations, learn new spells, etc. This is an important distinction because while it doesn't have a huge impact on the story, using the canisters technically alters your DNA, which does have some ramifications in the endings, even if it is minor. Overall, though, I did think that was a nice way to open up your options in terms of learning and expanding what your character's capable of doing without outright altering them fundamentally as a person in the gameplay. Then we have the gear, your magic items. You can equip things as you move through the game world. Obviously, exactly what you equip depends on what kind of character you're building. A Guardian's going to have pretty great melee weapons, or even potentially a ranged one, of course. A Shaper might not be so concerned about their own weapons, but will have magic items to boost their shaping skills, their magic ability, and things of that nature. They might use a wand, for instance. The main thing I want to get at here, though, is that I think they did a great job of improving the variety of magic items in this particular title. You find a lot more items in general with a lot more interesting effects that change exactly what they're improving on your character, such as base stats, shaping, mechanics, etc. And there were many times where I wasn't sure which item I wanted to equip because I wanted to build for a specific bonus in one instance, but another in a different use case. So just the fact that I was having those thoughts and deciding what equipment to put on when was a nice change. I would be remiss not to mention the artifacts though. There is a little bit of crafting in this one, both through craftsmen who can give you the best of the best stuff, the artifacts, and then there are a couple of items that you can actually improve over the course of the game, and those in the long run tend to be the best options. As you do certain optional content throughout the game's pretty large world map, you can find rare materials that you can then bring to a craftsman who can make you something unique, or you can bring it to an anvil and increase an item yourself if you've met the requirements, which usually involves dealing with a particularly challenging combat encounter alongside actually having the materials. So even in that way, they've enhanced the game quite a bit, and it was a much more enjoyable experience from a loot perspective this time around as well. Though that does naturally bring me to the gameplay and world section. Much like Geneforge 1, we are going to be on set maps, and exiting those maps at certain points will uncover the next map over from that on the world map. Once you have cleared these areas or turned them green on the world map by either simply moving in the correct direction or by solving some event that keeps you from traveling through there quickly, you can then fast travel to those areas on the map with ease. If an individual area is red though, you can't move through it safely and you'll have to go there manually and either solve it or, move through if you're not trying to solve it. I've always liked this approach. It makes the world feel a little more connected and alive, even in the case of these isometric games where it's not technically open world, but it feels like a world you are exploring, and I've always appreciated that approach. So functionally speaking, it works a lot like the original title. But there are a few other things I want to mention very specifically right here. Right away, I would say Geneforge 2 is a much more challenging title than the original because of how it deals with exploration. The map is what the map is, and it is possible to find high-level encounters very early if you're trying to explore thoroughly, and there is some stuff you'll just have to come back for later. And this is because what the game does after opening up outside of the initial area where you learn that the mountains are actually very green, is that it encourages you to explore. While you might want to encounter a faction and join it specifically, the game tells you, especially on the first time around, to go explore and talk to everybody before making a decision. And this means you can largely, as long as you have the abilities, go where you please. And you're actively encouraged to do that before making a decision about how to proceed for yourself. And if you're a little careless, you might run into things you're not quite prepared for, which I did frequently, especially on my first playthrough when I was learning where everything was. And I found just overall that made for a more challenging experience than the original, but once you've figured out where everything is, it's not a huge deal by any means. But again, it's just one of those things that makes this feel like a world you're exploring rather than an on-rails experience, which I really appreciated. And that, combined with a great tutorial that walks you through all of the things you might want to get to, and the various approaches you might want to take, I thought was great. But from there, let's talk about what the world is actually full of. Factions, quests, and just general content. Now, what you're actively trying to find as you move through the mountains are the towns of individual factions. There are 4 of them, but even then, you'll actually also encounter smaller groups that aren't necessarily factions in and of themselves, such as the Sholai, which are foreigners, effectively, and even they have things to offer and ideas to expand upon. So while the game can be very short if you're just rushing the main story, if you're doing everything and exploring, there's a ton of, I would say, really fantastic side content on display here that does a great job of fleshing out what the world outside of the Shapers and the gameplay map is all about, which is how I learned things about the Commons effectively ruling themselves and the Shapers only really deigning to intervene when their power is threatened. Commons are even allowed to learn magic on their own. They can be very accomplished wizards so long as they don't touch Shaper power, because only the Shapers get to decide who gets to learn that. And that's just a little taste of how they rule, and it tends to be through fear and awe. But let's talk a little bit about the factions of the game. There are 4 primary ones: the Servants, or the Loyalists you'll sometimes see them called, the Awakened, the Takers, and the Barzites. Let's start with the Servants, or the Loyalists, as that's who we encounter first. Simply put, they want to obey what the Shaper Council has said to do because they know if they don't, it'll bring the Shaper's wrath down upon them. And while they can certainly be tyrants, their laws don't exist for nothing. If you decide you like being what a Shaper is all about and you agree with the laws they've put down, you might want to join these people and side with them and complete their faction questline before reporting back to the council. Another appearing one is the Awakened. The Awakened are ruled by the Serviles, one of the main sort of labor force creations of the Shapers that have effectively gained intelligence, the ability to make their own magic, and even some limited powers of shaping, which is especially illegal in this context. But the Awakened, more than anything, simply want equal status. They want the Shapers to acknowledge that they have become their own people with their own culture, and they have the right to live as they see fit, not simply at the whims of the Shapers. And obviously the Shapers don't care for that much, and would rather just kill them all. Then you have the Takers. The Takers are also intelligent creations, but they have a very different view from the Awakened, who want peace with the Shapers in the long run. The Takers want them dead. They are mostly made up of creations that were barred by the Shapers after failures, such as Drakes and a couple others, and then they went on to make a new creation called the Drakon, which features in this game, and even another recent experimental one, such as the Gazer, which is kind of like a beholder from D&D, as an example. These barred creations, finding out that they just were flat out not allowed to exist technically, and were hunted down by the Shapers, took that as one might expect and decided that instead the Shapers needed to die. But in theory, they don't want every human to die. They're fine working with common humans, just not Shapers. Or at least so they say. But ultimately, creations that have learned and found the ability to make creations themselves are an incredible threat to the Shapers' power and authority. Last but not least, you then have a faction like the Barzites. The Barzites are effectively also Shapers, but pushed to the extreme for power. As I mentioned, Shaper laws for the most part exist for a reason. They believe in doing things like being very careful about how you create and introduce certain life so you don't destroy ecosystems, or simply have rogue creations running around, also destroying ecosystems, ravaging towns, killing people, etc. There are consequences to what a Shaper does. The Barzites aren't really concerned with these things. They want power for power's sake. They want to use the abilities of the Shapers to do what they want when they want, with not so much regard to the consequences, which might sound bad at first, but it is through a lot of this research and discovery that if you poke around the game a little bit, you'll find out that they've actually discovered what DNA legitimately is, as up to this point it was a magic art. As to what shaping was, I mean, but the Barzites have discovered that DNA exists and is a thing, and they're trying to unravel that mystery from a science standpoint as well. But they're doing so in the pursuit of self-perfection, and chasing down this knowledge that could potentially help people, but obviously with a lot of collateral damage. And while that's a basic rundown of it, I would say every single one of these does have a bit more nuance. It has very specific characters you're going to run into, and as I mentioned much earlier, what they say and what their actions tend to be might not necessarily line up, at least in my view. And I think all of that really paints this picture of an incredibly interesting world to explore, but I would be remiss not to mention that this is where the fact that it's an indie might drag it down a little bit for some people. This doesn't bother me, but a lot of this is shown through text on screen, none of it's voice acted, and there are other problems as well, such as pathing being a consistent issue, just that sort of old school CRPG gameplay not necessarily being everybody's cup of tea, but also a few more serious issues. Just to give an example with, I would say, the way a quest played out. I had a quest to sell a rare and valuable object to a very specific person, but it turned out I had already killed that specific person, so obviously that wasn't going to be something I could do. So the quest giver here also mentioned selling this item to other people as well, or that it was valuable and you could do that. So I just went and did that instead, thinking that like, oh, I'll just take the money from those and give it back to the person, since the original deal is clearly impossible. Except when I then went back to the quest giver, that person just decided I had sold it for my own gain and just wouldn't possibly give them anything back when I was like, I'm trying to give you the proceeds. That doesn't even make sense. That's just like a common sense reaction to this situation that wasn't plausible. So sometimes things like quest scripting, etc. will get in the way of your enjoyment a little bit, or at least it did for me at times. So it's not all sunshine and rainbows all the time. But by and large, I had a blast with it. Which brings me to the combat section of this particular title. Much like the first, this is a turn-based affair where you, your creations, and anything else really, are going to take turns, attack each other if you're actively engaged in combat and not trying to avoid it, and you're going to do this through weapons, your creations themselves, which will have their own abilities, your magic abilities, or a brand new thing called weapon shaping, which are abilities for your more martially oriented characters. On every character's turn, they're going to have action points that they can spend on either movement or utilizing their abilities. Now, typically speaking, attacking will end your turn, but not always. You can use a consumable item and then attack afterwards. You can move and then attack if it doesn't take all of your action points. And there are some attacks even that won't actually take all of your action points as well, allowing you to double up on actions. You can also utilize consumables to do things like, say, haste yourself or use magic, for instance, to do that, which gives you the potential to be able to take 2 attacks in a turn. So there's ways to mix that up, and that's before you even introduce things like magic or your weapons or your weapon shaping. These are going to give you all sorts of situational options. I will say with the magic in particular, not unlike the Pathfinder games, I found pre-buffing very, very useful, especially on the higher difficulties, where instead of wasting turns in combat buffing up my creations and myself if I was actually going the combat route, it was usually better to do that before you got into combat. But as you gain magic abilities or weapon shaping, you'll have more that you can do yourself on top of what your creations are capable of. All of this tends to cost either essence or energy or a combination of the two though, so it's important to manage those resources in combat on top of your actual health. Now, weapon shaping is new to Geneforge 2 here, but it's basically just like weapon abilities. It's nothing major, but it is nice to have, where effectively you can use your shaping to charge up future attacks or use abilities that help you out in ways that aren't simply creating life, but rather augmenting your weaponry. But then we have the creations themselves. In order to make a creation, you just have to click on the plus icon below your portrait. If you have space, you can have a total of 7 of these guys with you, provided you have the essence to make them. Your essence, the amount of which is decided by your stats, is what you need to create them. The more complicated the creation, the more essence it costs. Based on the creations you know how to make, you can pick either it or its alternate form, and then choose which abilities you'd like to give that creation, such as extra health, damage, etc. from any of the modifiers available on an individual basis, which increases the essence cost but also the level, and also your will required to control that creature. Controlling all of your creations is important because the more you have and the stronger they are, the harder they are to control, and they can go rogue in combat, either attacking you or simply running away from the battle, which is where a skill like leadership comes in, because while that also has non-combat applications, in combat it helps you maintain control over your creations in addition to just your level. There are a lot of potential creations, each representing a different school of shaping, including a few new ones compared to the original title, but also some special secret ones you can find. And overall, I really liked the variety on display here. There were a lot of cool ones, such as the Gazer or the Dracons that you can make, and also some useful returning ones. And I would say the key thing to know about them is probably just to not get too attached to them individually, because they're kind of meant to be expendable in some ways, and that really shows in combat. They can get killed pretty easily, but you can also just make new ones pretty easily, which I think is a nice gameplay touch, at least in terms of the ethics of taking care of these things. All of that said though, combat is a relatively simple affair, and I will say that if you're having trouble with the feedback in combat, as it can lack a certain amount of visual clarity until you get used to what you're looking at, you can hit the T key on a keyboard to bring up a log of sorts that will actually show you what has been happening, which I found helpful and I actually missed in my look at the original title. And while broadly speaking, I think combat works pretty well, even if it's a bit simple and again, lacks, I would say, modern features like any sense of verticality, for instance. One glaring issue that does come up is that your pathing both in and out of combat for creations can be pretty bad. In combat, this means that a lot of times the preview for your movement is actually wrong, or that is to say the game simply isn't going to do it. Now, originally, and this was a thing about the visual clarity, in my first impressions video, I think I mentioned something about the green squares being where you could move, but that's actually wrong. That is your zone of control around your character. If enemies get too close to you, or vice versa, you can stop them from moving too far if they're inside that area. And originally I mistook that as my movement range. But what actually is your movement range is when you click on an ability, the lightning bolt on the squares will show you where you can move and then still use that ability, if at all. But the thing is, if that's around a corner or anything, the game is not going to do it. It'll tell you it can, but it's not going to. Which means a lot of the time you'll have to manually position your creatures who would otherwise do this automatically when you click on the abilities, and that can get pretty tiring pretty fast. And it's one of many ways the quality of life features in this game I think could use a little bit of tweaking, and it's not anything major, but over the course of a longer RPG does kind of stack up on you and gets a little frustrating. All of that said though, let's finally start wrapping this thing up. First up, we have the Steam Deck compatibility. This game runs fantastically on the Steam Deck, no issues there, but there are two things to know. It does not have native controller support, which means you're likely going to have to adjust the keys if you want a smooth experience there. And that also means doing things like naming your save files when you go to save a game does require you to manually use the Steam's onboard keyboard, if you will, which can be a touch awkward. So the controls will likely have to be fiddled with, and then on top of that, the text for the game, which there is a lot of, can be a little small on that screen. I personally didn't have too many issues with that, but it is definitely a thing. Otherwise, though, the game ran flawlessly. You could definitely play this on the Steam Deck without any hassle, provided you are okay with both of those things. That, though, brings me to the positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, I loved the story and the world of this title. It really blew me away. Just a lot of the premises I already thought were cool from the original were expanded and worked upon in a way that was really fun. This is legitimately probably one of my favorite stories in gaming now because I thought this was just so great. And while the original game was very clunky in comparison to, I would say, similar games, the story of this is every bit on par with classic CRPGs, and it's worth exploring just for that. I also enjoyed how the game expanded upon other systems and mechanics in a way that felt familiar but also offered enough variation to feel fresh, like the weapon shaping and combat, the way you can learn skills from trainers, the brand new creations you can make, which opens up different opportunities to engage in combat a little bit differently than you might have before. All really does feel like the game is moving in the right direction. But there were nonetheless some negatives. I don't think these are major, but they are still there. Pathing was consistently an issue in and out of combat if you have more than just you in the party. If you're running like a single person for a pacifist run, yeah, it's not so bad. But especially if you have like 7 creations running around with you, pathing's pretty bad. In combat, it often just doesn't work the way it tries to tell you it will via a preview. You're going to have to manually move all of them, which gets clunky, let's say, very quickly. And then there's other quality of life issues, such as the lack of voice acting, which isn't a deal breaker for me personally. It's an indie title, so it's whatever, but I do think it's noteworthy. But there's also other little areas, such as, for instance, all of your magic and abilities down there that you can throw on your hotbar are associated with a certain type of magic that isn't mentioned in the tooltip, which means in order to find that, if you've forgotten, you have to bring up your character menu and then go to the only menu that actually breaks down by spell and ability what is under each type of skill for you, which can get frustrating when you have to do it multiple times for the sake of which equipment you want to use. And then there's issues like I mentioned with that quest, not really acknowledging what felt like would be a common sense solution to it. Other quests can actually break pretty easily if you go around killing anyone in like a town, for instance, which you might just do naturally in the course of a playthrough, and that might mess up a quest you run into later, for instance, which can get annoying. And while I'm not opposed to it just, failing that quest, a lot of the times it doesn't and can have some awkward quest interactions. None of that is really a deal breaker for me. I think mostly they're just minor annoyances, which brings me to my conclusion. Geneforge 2 is, I would say, a big step up from Geneforge 1, especially in the capacity of this release. And while some of it is certainly a little clunky, as most games of this type can be, I think there's a wonderful premise. I think there's some just great gameplay mechanics in there. But the real show stealer is the story and the world that is built around the rest of this. That part of the game had me hooked from pretty much start to finish, and I think did a fantastic job of exploring the world that was already built from the original title, which makes me especially curious how Geneforge 3 through 5 progress and change, as I've heard mixed things about them. But broadly speaking, I loved the story and world. I had a great time with the rest of it for the most part, and for a game that is only running you $20 US, makes it extremely easy to recommend. It's quite cheap, so if you enjoy this type of game pretty much at all, it's a no-brainer. Definitely one to pick up, which means it's a buy from me, which is pretty much going to wrap up this review, so I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.